Okay, we are back for the third last session for the day. It is my pleasure to introduce Edan Yago, who is the founding core contributor of BitcoinOS. He is also the founder of Sovereign, a Bitcoin trading and lending platform, as well as the founder and CEO of Cement DAO, which is a decentralized exchange platform for stablecoins. In addition to this, he's also the founder and CEO of the FFite Corporation. And today, Yago joins us. His session is titled Technical Innovations Enhancing Bitcoin Reserves. Yago has also let me know that he's very open and to questions. So please feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen, and he will try and answer as many as possible. Thank you, Yago. I'll leave it to you to continue. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sonia. Yeah, so if anyone does feel like they at any point want to engage in conversation, I'll try and keep an eye on the Q&A and respond. In 2011, I was holed up. It was extremely cold. There was uh, deep snow, and so I was holed up in the basement of the biology and computation department at Carnegie Mellon. I was working on machine learning and neural networks, and I was trying to model um, human neural networks in silicon. And I read the wrong white paper, and it screwed up my life plans entirely, because I was trying to read papers in network science, and I read the Bitcoin white paper, and before I'd even finished the paper, I had chills running down my spine, and the reason was that, like Sonia, who just introduced me, I come from South Africa originally, and in South Africa, we had significant capital controls and a pretty complicated, still do have a pretty complicated political environment. When I was a young boy, my family were members of the ANC. This was Nelson Mandela's, at the time, designated terrorist group. And so my family, by extension, were designated as terrorists. And some of them were forced to flee the country. And so between the ages of 9 and 11, I found myself smuggling gold out of South Africa in the form of Kruger rands that my mother would sew into my clothing and send me off on plane trips, because they wouldn't search kids. So I grew up with a deep understanding of how fragile our freedoms are and how tied they are to um, our property rights and our financial rights. And I had become fascinated with the internet and fascinated with digital technologies over the years. And in this paper, I suddenly read the discovery, the invention of digital property rights. And it screwed up all of my life plans, because I sort of emailed everyone telling them that they have to get involved with Bitcoin. And I have been involved ever since. And what I've been trying to do is utilize this new discovery, Bitcoin, which I think is the world's most remarkable, most powerful system of property rights ever developed, to expand the types of properties, the types of assets, and the types of rights that we can have access to. And so over the years, that is what I've been engaged in. Epifite, for example, was a company where it was one of the first companies to perform cross-border payments utilizing Bitcoin as a settlement mechanism. And we were able to get funds into countries that would be very difficult otherwise due to capital controls: Zimbabwe, Brazil, Thailand, uh, um, uh, Nigeria. Later, I helped create a system which allowed people to make donations to countries where it was very difficult to make donations to. So, for example, in 2014, during the Maidan protests in Ukraine, all of the banks were shut down. Ukraine had been cut off from the world, and we managed to get donations into Ukraine in the form of BTC. But my primary focus throughout this period has been on trying to build out those technologies which would allow us to use BTC, the asset, um, in more sophisticated ways. Today, even today, mostly what you can do with it is basically hold it as is the um, topic of today's conversation. Hold it in reserve, right? People can buy it. They don't really use it for transactions. They don't really use it for more sophisticated financial tooling. And then Bitcoin, the chain, Bitcoin, the ledger, is really only a ledger for a single asset today, not a general purpose ledger protecting a large number of assets. And so it was those two twin problems that I have been um, working on tackling and building the technologies to allow us to tackle over the course of the now almost 15 years that I've been working in the Bitcoin space. And so while I've been in Bitcoin for what I think counts as a pretty long time now, um, what we are experiencing now is by far the most remarkable moment I remember or have experienced with Bitcoin, with the possible exception of the very earliest days. I sometimes say that right now we are all early to Bitcoin again. And that transformation is happening on two levels. The first level, which I think has been discussed quite extensively today in this sort of conference, is the regulatory change, and with it, the changing approach to adoption that is occurring with BTC. So BTC, the asset, has was under sanction effectively by most governments, and in particular, the most important sort of economically important government in the world for most of its history. You could not, and banks could not, and financial institutions could not deal easily with BTC. In many ways, it felt like the BTC economy, the Bitcoin economy, and by extension, the entire crypto economy was sort of in the same bucket as Iran and North Korea, sanctioned and sidelined. That has not just changed, it has completely reversed. We are now in a remarkable situation where the largest financial institutions in the world and the world's leading governments are all scrambling to figure out how they can integrate and begin to utilize BTC, the asset, as a strategic reserve. And that is a story and a conversation which I think has been discussed a great deal. What is happening, however, less observed, perhaps for most people under the surface, is that Bitcoin is right now undergoing a perhaps as substantial, maybe I would argue, even more substantial transformation, which has to do with the technology. We right now are in a period where pretty much all of the limitations that we've assumed around Bitcoin, its limitations around scale, its limitations around programmability, the limitations of what kind of programmability uh, uh, um, you can have with Bitcoin, and the types of assets that could exist on the Bitcoin network, these are all dissolving. We are, and I'm proud to say I'm a big part of this. I am part of a group of people who are now becoming an entire industry, building transformational technologies for Bitcoin, releasing it from all of these limitations. And I think this has profound implications on the near future, the long term future of Bitcoin, profound implications for the crypto industry, and profound implications for finance and the internet. And so, what I'd like to do is today give a brief overview and answer any questions that anyone might have of these changes. Discuss briefly what the implications are, um, and try to draw, again briefly because we have limited time, a picture of where I think this is all going. So let me start with the three primary limitations that um, Bitcoin has had up until now. So, limitation number one has been around scale. Um, the number of transactions that can be processed by Bitcoin have been extremely limited. And so that has significantly limited the types of uses that Bitcoin could be applied to. The second is throughput, um, which is, or perhaps I should say speed, right? The speed at which transactions can be cleared and processed before being finally settled on Bitcoin. And then the third is the ability to build applications and introduce other assets into the Bitcoin network. Now, all three of those are currently dissolving, and the reason they're dissolving fundamentally comes down to two things which have changed in the Bitcoin um, technological space, the design space available to developers and builders building on Bitcoin. The first change was in 2021, there was an introduction to Bitcoin of uh, uh, taproot transactions, a new structure of transactions. And these transactions allowed for much more complex types of cryptography to become available on Bitcoin. It has taken us as developers a really long time to start to realize and eke out an understanding of how we can utilize this new design space to do really remarkable things. But we are now starting to see the fruits of that. The second big innovation actually did not occur in Bitcoin, but turns out is extremely applicable to Bitcoin. And this is the ability to use a type of cryptography called zero knowledge cryptography or zero knowledge proofs. When these two things are combined, what it potentially allows is for you to be able to perform computation off chain, but have that computation become apparent, become visible, and secured by the Bitcoin chain. Or, as I like to say, if we had some way to perform transactions and computations outside of Bitcoin, but introduce proofs of that activity through zero knowledge proofs, then we would be giving Bitcoin for the first time eyes and a brain. Bitcoin would suddenly awake to to the outside world, and so that would be the opening of its eyes. But beyond that, it would have the ability to actually process and understand these transactions, and so um, bring that activity into the Bitcoin fold. Now, the role that I've played in this has been primarily around the zero knowledge part, and so I'll explain very briefly what zero knowledge cryptography is and why it's so powerful. Zero knowledge cryptography is a way to prove that something happened without having to show how it happened or to provide the data. So, for example, let's say we wanted to have a computer game, something immense, right? Computer games are huge, highly intense pieces of computational activity. But imagine we wanted to have this huge chunk of computational activity become available, secured by Bitcoin. So the game developer could build something and could provably show that they could not cheat even in their own creation. And the game developer would not only be able to do that, but be able to create and issue assets in the game, which would become available on Bitcoin, the network, and also allow people to begin to use BTC in the game, or maybe Bitcoin backed stablecoins in the game, without ever having to take a custodial approach. In other words, imagine you could have something running outside of Bitcoin, but interacting with Bitcoin and being secured by Bitcoin. a bit of a mind-bending concept. But the remarkable thing is that is now possible. And it's been possible for about 6 months, at least theoretically, and it is now becoming possible from a implementation perspective very rapidly. In other words, it's not only now possible, but it is becoming practical. And so the role that I played in this is that I'm part of a group which managed to devise a system which we call BitSnark, which allows for the verification of this kind of zero knowledge cryptography, and right, the ability to take computation, compress it into a tiny proof, and put it into Bitcoin. And we're able to demonstrate for the first time in block 853,626 in July of last year, the first ZK proof on Bitcoin, the first time that Bitcoin opened its eyes and was able to start thinking and understanding things that were happening outside of it. All right, so I've given a toy example around how this might be useful. Now, let me talk about three key implications of what this means. The first is that we can now create systems where we are able to make the same distinction that exists in much of finance between clearing and settlement, where you could have many, many thousands of transactions clear, right? People would be able to transact off chain thousands of Bitcoin transactions. You would then be able to aggregate or fold these transactions into a single proof, which gets written to Bitcoin, effectively turning all of those transactions in aggregate into Bitcoin transactions. So you're able to now scale Bitcoin uh, uh, to to a degree that was never possible before, and it is effectively potentially infinite, right? So we now have Bitcoin as a monetary and assets network, a settlement network, which is able to provide for infinite scale. The second thing, and this is perhaps the thing which is driving the technology forward the most right now, is that this opens up opportunities for people to integrate Bitcoin into all kinds of other environments, other chains, other systems, exchanges, and DeFi or decentralized financial applications that can be built directly onto Bitcoin, allowing BTC to go from being a simply passive instrument into one which is able to be actively used both as collateral and as a yield bearing instrument. And right now, the race is on to try and build out those tools, which are going to generate or provide the opportunities for the safest, most non safest most counterparty risk free forms of financial activity with Bitcoin that have ever existed. The third thing which is happening, and which we expect to demonstrate over the next few weeks, is the ability to now also utilize Bitcoin to issue any kind of asset. So you could imagine bonds being issued on Bitcoin. You could imagine a real estate being tokenized on Bitcoin, as well as potentially a large number of other types of asset classes which might just be invented on Bitcoin. And this is particularly important and interesting because at the same time that Bitcoin is being adopted by governments, by large financial institutions as the most trusted cross-border, uh, uh, credibly neutral network in the world, it is now becoming not just a ledger which can be used for BTC, but a ledger which can be used for potentially any arbitrary set of assets, some of which might be fully native to Bitcoin, some of which might only be um, uh, using Bitcoin as a trust anchor. So, what this means for the broader crypto space is that I think one of the challenges that crypto has had up until now has been the challenge of building what are effectively very ephemeral systems. Ethereum, Solana, all of these other chains, they have been built like software. And so they come and they go and they change. And they haven't had the kind of permanence that Bitcoin has, which is what is required for property rights. And so Tyler has asked me, what do I think about Cardano? Cardano being one of these very large chains that has been built ostensibly initially as a competition to Bitcoin, is now in the process of effectively utilizing the technology that we're constructing at BitcoinOS BOSS to integrate itself and effectively become an additional layer to Bitcoin. And so where I think all of this is ultimately heading is that what the internet has been missing from its very, very inception is a module, is a function of property rights, right? You can use Bitcoin, you can use the internet to transfer information, but you cannot use it to store value. And so people have been talking for the last 15 years about building an internet of value. And I think what we're now discovering is that Bitcoin, as it is being integrated with the traditional financial world and is becoming its own asset class, it is doing something perhaps even more remarkable, which is that instead of us trying to figure out some blockchain on which we will build a new internet of value, Bitcoin is itself going to become integrated into the very fabric of the internet itself and act as a addition, an additional network woven into the overall internet network, and represent an entirely new way of us providing for assets, private property, individual digital identity rights, all of the rights that we've basically been missing on the internet, we can now integrate into the security of Bitcoin itself. And so Bitcoin will become another module within the overall fabric of the internet and the digital world in which we're living. And I think this is an extremely exciting moment because